to the we want to welcome everybody to the first CASE CSA SOE webinar of 2025. We are very excited to present our webinar today. What do we know about Canadian schools, systemic gaps in pan-Canadian education datasets, and First Nations education in Ontario? While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take this moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nation, and Métis peoples. We invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside by going to nativeland.ca. So today, what we have a live closed captioning is available as a live transcript. What we're going to do is we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So please save your questions and they can be entered through the Q&A. You can also vote. You can upvote a question if you see it and you don't want to replicate that. So we will be addressing the questions after the initial discussion and I will be moderating. So today's presentations, the first presenter we have is Dr. Christine Corso. What do we know about Canadian schools? A scoping review of pan-Canadian education datasets. Our second speaker is Dr. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, who's going to be presenting systemic gaps in First Nations education in Ontario, provincial funded schools, disproportionate discipline, and high absenteeism. Join us as we welcome Dr. Christine, which should be doctor. You could be a double doctor. Dr. Christine Corso. I noticed the doctor. Dr. Christine Corso is going to be our first presenter, presenting a scoping review on pan-Canadian schools.
Thank you so much, Alana. Yeah, I was like, I think I only did one doctor, but yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting a scoping review, and I just want to note that this is a work in progress, and there will be a point at the end where I'm going to ask for input from you all because you are the community that would also know the best about some of these issues with pan-Canadian education data. So this is a paper that I'm working on with Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, the co-presenter for today, as well as Annie Kidder, and special thanks to Fiona Deller. This is work that has been a collaboration between People for Education and Laurier. And before we start, I just want to set the tone for both Kelly and my papers today about why education-related data is important and what are some of the issues in Canada with doing education-related research and with data sets. So it is understood that policy is supposed to be based on some sort of evidence. And understandably, we are humans. We make emotional decisions. We make decisions based on values. So we are working within a political setting and within a framework of bounded rationality. Having said that, when policy decisions are made, it's important that we're able to somehow investigate whether they have made a difference. So, for instance, a really important issue is to track progress towards equity goals in a number of areas. This is a key issue in education, and if we don't have data that speaks to identity markers, for instance, then we cannot do any research to work towards those goals. Education also is important in a pan-Canadian sense rather than just within the province or territory, because education is a key lever in enacting social change. So while provinces and territories have complete jurisdiction over education, and that is something that is fiercely guarded. So education in BC looks very different from right next door in Alberta, and that's fine. But when we have goals about society and how we want to progress our economy, our society, and our sustainability going forward as a nation, we have a perfectly suitable vehicle in public education where many students in Canada, over 90% of students attend publicly funded schools. And we can use that as an opportunity. It's already baked into our system to work towards those Canada-wide goals. But we need to be talking across systems in order to do so. So the issues related to education data sets in Canada have been well documented by my co-author, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, as well as Karen Robson and others. And so that we know there's issues, challenges doing education research in Canada. And if you are an education researcher in Canada that works with data sets, then you might be familiar with those challenges as well. And if you've worked in other jurisdictions, you might know the great wealth of data that some places have. So, for instance, and not to say that this is something that needs to happen in Canada or that there aren't perils associated with the datification of education writ large, but just as examples, in Australia, you can access a data dashboard that compares the sociodemographic profile of your school to the rest of Australia, as well as staffing information. The same in England or the US. So these are staffing data over time and absenteeism for each school. So compared to the local authority or like school board compared to all of England. So why don't we have this in Canada? And I've already given away the plot of one of the issues, but I'll outline what 4 key issues that have been denoted in the literature. So the data are not always collected, first of all. So if we want to track systemic discrimination, for instance, we actually need data for that. But in most provinces, we don't collect race-based data tied to education. So that's actually an issue. Sometimes the data just are not there. And if we want to challenge something using legal pathways, we need data to be able to do that. Second, data are not always published. So data sets that are available through the open access portals, some of them are available, but some of them are, you need to request data. And I would bet that some people sitting in this webinar right now are waiting for data to come back from data requests. They take a long time. They're really onerous to complete the requests. And sometimes in certain cases, if you're dealing with individual level data, you need pretty high level security clearance yourself in order to access it. But in other cases, you are working with completely anonymized data and data suppression, but you still have to request to access this data. The data are not always comparable. This is because of the federalism I alluded to earlier. Each province or territory has completely different collection procedures, does education administration differently. And then finally, they're not usually linked. So linked means a few different things here. Not always linked. I do mean also in the ways here linked to demographic information, geographic information, talking about urban versus rural, talking about different neighborhoods, but also they're not linked from post-secondary to high school. They're not linked from health to education. We talk about knowing that education is a social determinant of health, but how are we to go about doing social determinant of health research that links educational opportunities with long-term health outcomes if we cannot link these data sets? So we're not just talking about issues in education-related data. There have also been calls for better data in Canada among health and mental health sectors. And the UN has even called us out in working towards the Convention on the Rights of the Child and towards achieving our goals. The UN has said that we need to have better data collection infrastructure and data collection systems at the federal level. These things need to be across Canada. We need to have data disaggregated by age, sex, disability, geographical location, ethnic and national origin, and socioeconomic background. And all of those things seem very basic, but that is a tall order for many systems in Canada. So given that and given the issues, so this paper is not about the issues. This paper is about what data sets do exist. And when we talk about gaps in data, we wanted to be able to get more specific about where are the gaps in education data. So we conducted a scoping review to figure out what data sets exist related to K-12 education in Canada. We were searching for data sets or presentations of data, and by that could mean like a report or a slide deck. Could be that the survey was alluded to, so we knew the data must have been collected, but not always is the data set itself available. And data could refer to like survey results, administrative data, student outcome data, but all related to schools, I should say, sorry, public schools in Canada. So as long as public schools are related and not just post-secondary or ECE like K-12 schools. And we searched government websites, educational research organizations, and agencies. And then the kind of list that came out of this, we coded it based on the name and purpose and organization, as well as the region it referred to, so whether it was Canada-wide or just in certain jurisdictions, and who responded, whether the data is something that refers to the whole population, like a census, or just a sample, how if it's a recurring type of data that was collected, and then whether the data is available. And the result of this is kind of a living document, and we're still working on it. So yeah, we're hoping for your input today. And I'll present the results kind of outside in, so like Canada-wide, down to multi-jurisdictional, then provincial, territorial, and then boards. And the boards are just or districts. There's there's many boards in Canada, so we didn't go thoroughly through all the boards, just kind of grabbed some samples of what was out there. Okay, so starting at the beginning, if we think about what education information is out there Canada-wide, you would think the best place to look is this semi-annual report called the Education Indicators in Canada, because that's going to be talking about everything we know about education in Canada. So that's where we started. And it's got several sections, 5 sections here. So the first one is a portrait of school-age children. It's just demographic data from the census. It's got really rich data, but the problem is that it doesn't locate that data to a school or a school board or anything like that. It's just about demographics in general in Canada. Then we have the education system finance. Again, it's very helpful information, but the lowest level of specificity is the province or territory. I'm going to hold off on the elementary secondary education section for a second, because you'd think that's going to be where the treasure trove is. In the post-secondary education section, we do have information about participation. In post-secondary, we have the PIAC. I want to point out is from 2012. So the PIAC is the adults skills study that the OECD administers. And the latest that we have is from 2012. Which is another indication of where we're at, kind of. And then university staff and research funding. So helpful, but not necessarily about K-12. And then transitions and outcomes. And this is lots of census data, which is very rich, again, about education attainment, employment, income, all those things that are kind of like downstream impacts or effects of education. But in terms of elementary and secondary education, like the what happens in schools, we have information about educators. So the gender, age, contract status, salaries of educators. Okay, great. On-time graduation, great. Again, disaggregated by gender only, so not by race, not by any other factors. And then we have instructional time, the aims of instructional time for each province, student achievement through PISA, which is the OECD administered assessment, and then PCAP, which is our Made in Canada one. But yeah, that's it. And then we look at in this section, for instance, again, like early years in school readiness, we've been told this is archived information, refer to previous sections. So we know that there are data gaps here and that we're missing some things. But we also know that the indicators report is not the end all, like that's not where data ends in Canada. So looking at the census, for instance, the census has a wealth of data, and it has data that can be kind of correlated with one another. So here we see, for instance, highest educational attainment that is disaggregated by racial group. And we can do that with employment, we can do that with income. There's like lots of geography. There's some tables you can find about what the focus of people's post-secondary education is by what city and town they live in. So this is very interesting information. And then we also have other large-scale assessments that, as I'll talk about in a minute, are participated in by certain provinces and territories. We also have a school facilities database that is really um, that I think is telling in that there's a lot of information, sorry, there's a lot of writing in the preamble of it about how hard it was to harmonize the information across provinces and territories. And it's just a list of all the schools that exist and like their locations, like their addresses. But it was even very difficult for, and not to say that it's not serious work, but that is really important to know where the schools exist across Canada. Using geographical location, we can then link to other census information. But all of these require lots of data harmonization work because we're talking about so many different systems. Um, I want to give an example also the of the individual. So not a lot of these data sets are going to provide the individual linkages from as a person travels through different systems, but I want to give a good example because the ELMLP deserves a shout out here. So post-secondary information system has been linked up with the apprenticeship information system and has also been linked to later outcomes of income through the TI, through annual income estimates. And in two provinces, in BC and Ontario, these data about individuals have also been linked to track how they, the administrative data that they had in elementary and high school in BC or in high school in Ontario. So gender, location, graduation, exam marks, things like that. And so altogether, that gives you a much more rich database that you could understand how things track over time, the ELMLP. So it's a really great example of how linking up our databases could be helpful. However, this is not available for every province, and this is not available tracking students from K through 12 in particular in every province. There are also other ways that we can talk about students in schools besides just looking at school data. So well-being of students sometimes gets at what school experiences have been. Also, well-being is an important outcome of education, like in and of itself. So for instance, we have the WHO's Health Behaviors in School-Aged Children study. We can see here that we're talking about students that are in school. Issues such as bullying, such as social media use, such as sleep hygiene, like all of these are information that can help us make decisions about school as well. Some of these are focused on the entire population, for instance, the Canadian Health Measures Survey, but we may be able to then talk about only children in that. Usually I'll show you in a second, there's different types of cutoffs. The Indigenous Peoples Survey does actually ask specifically about school attendance, about moving schools, about Indigenous language programs, homework, reading, absences, all sorts of great school-related outcomes. But yeah, most Statistics Canada surveys are for 15-year or older Canadians. And so then they kind of get grouped into this aged 15 to 24 year like youth category. And the problem is that youth then talks about not just high school students, but also post-secondary students. And those are not two similar systems. Like we have very different policy responses to whether students are in public or versus post-secondary education. Okay, so beyond the Canada-wide stuff, that's kind of the summary of what we have Canada-wide, but we have other multi-jurisdictional data. The incredible like ADI and MDI, these are used by multiple jurisdictions. The issue is that there isn't always ways to link all of these things up so that you could talk about individuals as linking their EDI outcomes with other outcomes such as all of the administrative data sets that are available from the province, like graduation and absentee, if that's available. We also have certain studies, for instance, the university, like university-based studies that might have samples that are in multiple jurisdictions, like the COMPAS study of adolescent health in Alberta and Ontario, or the Canadian Teachers Federation, other organizations that do research across provincial and territorial boundaries about teachers' work or school-based resources. And then there's provincial and territorial data. So understanding the understanding that provinces and territories are kind of in charge of their own administration of education, then it makes sense that they would be the ones to provide more evidence. So provinces and territories do. They always provide the information that is going to be in the indicators report because that's mandatory to report up to the federally anyways. They also have information about provincial assessments. So just a reminder for those who might not be familiar, we have our international large-scale assessments that are administered by the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada. These are based on samples. So PISA from the OECD, PCAP, which is made in Canada, TIMSS and PEARLS, these are based on samples of students. We talk mostly about PISA and PCAP, but it's still not participated in by samples from all of Canada. There are no territories represented, just provinces. And TIMSS and PEARLS are participated in by even fewer jurisdictions. For instance, BC and Alberta only did the grade 4 TIMSS last cycle, and Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador are the only ones that did both. So with that aside, then there's provincial assessments, which other than Saskatchewan, everyone's got a provincial assessment, and that's census-based. So that's everyone writes these. And they have different purposes. So they might be for accreditation, such as in Ontario, the Ontario literacy test or the grade 12 exams in many places. They might be for accountability or transparency, and they might be reported back to schools for school improvement. So those are what's always reported on at the province, but there's rarely data disaggregated. Often disaggregated by gender, yes. Sometimes by disability, sometimes by indigeneity. In Nova Scotia, for instance, there's disaggregations by African descent. But it's very rare that we get all racial groups disaggregated when in the province level reporting. There's also sometimes very interesting other information, such as schools offering specialty programs, or there's a school satisfaction information presented in BC and Alberta. Credit completion is provided by Manitoba and Northwest Territories in certain courses, etc. So I'm going to, because I seem to run out of time constantly when I do these things. Okay, I'm gonna just talk briefly about, so board collected data. Boards obviously have lots of data that they collect because they are the ones providing report card marks. They're the ones who are, managing the intake and movement of students. But this data is not always reported out. And we know that any of us who've, worked with school boards or know people in school boards know that that's very often because of capacity. They may have one researcher, they may not have a research department. And some school boards, have been doing fabulous research, but often there's no reporting on demographics. And often what's used are school climate surveys, lots of school climate surveys. It's interesting when we see, sometimes I'm showing one here that's like a standardized, like kind of school climate survey, that a tool that's used by lots of school boards. So maybe there's an opportunity there to link more data up, but not necessarily always. Okay, so in conclusion, if we think about kind of our system of education data that we could have, of spanning from a population of children who move through learning opportunities and particularly go to schools where most of their learning might take place, and then those lead to academic and well-being outcomes, and then we have downstreams, adults who have academic, economic, and well-being outcomes. The majority of the data that we have, that I found based on this scoping review, exist in our outcomes, our adult outcomes, so like very far downstream population outcomes, as well as some inputs. So for instance, how many teachers do you have? What are they paid? How much money do we put into the school system? And then we have information about the demographic population of children and youth. But we have this like missing middle of what happens in schools and how do all the different types of inputs that go into schools at a school level, at a district level, at a neighborhood level, make differences for kids, or just how can we link those? And then importantly, also linking all these things through so that we have all this rich data about are the population of students that are in Canada, but we don't necessarily link all of that demographic information as we track the outcomes all the way through. So for a more complete, balanced diet of what we're making policy decisions based on, if we could try and de-emphasize, or not de-emphasize, but if we could try to balance out by looking inside this middle part of the learning opportunities, then it could help us balance that out. So I have some questions for the group now, and or just a reminder, this is a work in progress. And I have noticed people have been writing in the chat, and I hope that it's okay that I hadn't really been reading to this point. But now I do want you to write in the chat. Please, thank you. Are there any important data sources that are not included here that we should be looking at, that I should know about? And then also, or maybe I'll take these one at a time. So yeah, are there any important data sources that are not included here that should be included? And I'm taking a look to see that I do know oh yeah, the PIAC. So I think what's interesting, noting that the PIAC was released most recently, is that our data indicators report from 2024 does not have that PIAC result in it. So whether it's a representation issue, whether we didn't have adequate Canadian participation to warrant it in a Canada-wide report, or whether it's that we didn't participate at all, but PIAC was not included in our 2024 release of the indicators report.
Okay,
all the data sets that are helpful for people that they've been using. I am curious also what you see as the biggest data gaps for yourself as researchers, but also for educators and education systems, and for public awareness and accountability, driving that public conversation about the importance of public education, because they're different purposes. And most extensive district level data. Yeah, and that's a good point as well. How do we incorporate the most extensive district level data into this collection, because it's not necessarily true of every district. So yeah, that's something that we're trying to grapple with as well. And like I said in the last slide, it's like, could we link any of them together? Maybe they're using common tools, but that is difficult. And yeah, like I said, we'll get to some of the Q&A, I think, more afterwards. But yeah, if you have any thoughts about these three questions, please feel free to email me. I know I'll just wrap up so that we can have a greater discussion about this after Kelly's presentation. But our next steps as a team are to create this regularly updated index of available data in Canadian education. And then also, we're also hoping to build some sort of academic collaborative that could work towards Canada-wide data standards or data minima, so that we could understand what would we need on a minimum to be able to work towards our goals of what we need to track to get to our equity goals, to get to our accountability towards our policy goals. And then finally, developing an annual Canadian school survey to fill in known gaps where we see those actual gaps happening. And so right now, I am working with Kelly Gallagher-Mackay as well as Annie Kidder and People for Education to develop such an annual Canadian school survey. So thank you so much. And as the two presenters today, please feel free to email either of us, as I said, with your thoughts on any of those questions. Be happy to receive any feedback about the data scan as it's going, but also happy to talk to you all about it in the Q&A in just a minute.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Corso, for your presentation. Just a reminder for everyone, we normally do save the questions until the end. However, it was a part of Dr. Corso's presentation to solicit, since it's a work in progress, soliciting some ideas. So in the chat, I've also posted Dr. Corso's email. So please, if you have any more comments or questions as Dr. Corso is soliciting some feedback, please send the email. But we will have a discussion. I would like to apologize in advance that we are going until 3 o'clock, although the Zoom invitation for some of you said 1 to 2:30, but we do have until 3. So we're going to go on to Dr. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, and then we will have a 30-minute period from about roughly 2:30 to 3 for additional Q&A and more questions too. So at that point. So at this point, I would like to welcome Dr. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, who is an associate professor and program coordinator in Law and Society at Wilfrid Laurier University. The presentation is called Systemic Gaps in First Nations Education in Ontario's Provincially Funded Schools, Disproportionate Discipline and High Absenteeism. Welcome, Dr. Mackay, Gallagher-Mackay. Sorry.
Hi, I apologize. It took me a minute to get my toolbar back. So it's my pleasure to follow Christine's conversation, and I hope that you'll see these as two pieces of a whole. Both of us share a deep concern about the lack of essential descriptive data for understanding the Canadian educational systems, and particularly issues of equity across Canada and for particular populations. And I wanted to share a research project I've engaged in that I'm hoping you will agree with me shows the importance of being able to do this kind of work. This is a research project that emerged through a partnership with the Chiefs of Ontario, which is a group that I'll explain about in a little bit. We've actually published these two reports, and if anyone wants to see the reports themselves, they can take a second to scan this code. I hope you can do that. So there's two reports that we published with the Chiefs of Ontario. I wanted to start by talking about our purposes in this project, and I thought rather than me talking about it, I would have my colleague Neil DeBassi, who's one of the co-authors of the reports, explain our purposes. Neil is a First Nations educator and researcher, and a former principal in both provincially funded and First Nations schools. So here we go.
Ani, Bojo, Neil Dawaski, Indijnakas, Chiging Donjaba. I'm here today to talk to you about an exciting and important partnership. It's a program between the Chiefs of Ontario, Laurier University, and hopefully you, a participating First Nation. We're talking about a review and analysis of the systemic gaps in K-12 education for First Nation learners. Now, over the last 5 decades, there have been multiple calls for change, from the Indian control of Indian education back in '72 to most recent legislation, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, right? They all call for change. We know there needs to be a needs-based new funding formula approach that respects First Nation jurisdiction, but also focuses on reducing the educational gaps that exist for First Nation learners. Now, this project is an answer to the TRC calls to action, specifically number 9 and 10, where we called upon the federal government to compare and publish annual reports for funding on Indigenous education and First Nation education. And we also talked about how that funding should be sufficient to close those gaps in achievement. The goals of this particular project are very, very important. They're going to identify the educational significant disparities in opportunities and outcomes of First Nation schooling. It's also going to help you in your negotiations, whether it's in a regional education agreement, a self-government agreement, or to enhance the interim funding formula for equitable funding in support of those truth and reconciliation calls to action. And lastly, we want to develop a baseline of data. It's so important to understand where our learners are in real time so that we can take a look at and study how our efforts to improve their achievement, how we're making out in that regard. Now, this project is going to take a
Okay, I'm gonna stop at that point and resume the presentation, but I hope that gives you broad context for what we were trying to do. The goal of the Chiefs of Ontario is to track, to meet the commitments of the Truth and Reconciliation by tracking key systemic gaps for First Nations students. And this is a little bit about who the Chiefs of Ontario are. They're an organization that doesn't represent, but coordinates the 133 First Nations in the province of Ontario. It helps pick priorities for lobbying and creates positions and action. In order to undertake this systemic gaps analysis, we had a couple of key questions for research design, which I think as sociologists, you'll all understand. Each of these questions requires a fair bit of consideration. The first one is, what are the educationally important gaps we care about? Second, who are we studying here? And also, are we studying the systems or the students or both? How do we do this? What are valid, comparable, and potentially available ways to fairly efficiently assess any disparities? Who controls the data? That's particularly critical for First Nations education. I think many of you will be familiar with OCAP principles, which state that ownership, control, access, and possession of data on First Nations communities and individuals needs to belong to the communities, not to the government, not to researchers. So how do you make that work? And how do we make sure that this is useful data? And I think, one of the big red button issues here is a lot of concern that much of the talk of gaps, it can be very useful for demonstrating systemic discrimination, for making calls for equitable funding, but there's also a risk that it becomes a label and reinscribes disadvantage. So that fundamental concern is why it's so important that this project be initiated and controlled throughout by the Chiefs of Ontario, not anybody else. So I wanted to run through those questions and start by talking about how we know what the educationally important measures we wanted to track are. And that is something that sounds very obvious, but there is not a Canadian consensus around the critical education data we need to be collecting at the system level. And that's really where this presentation connects to what Christine was talking about. Something that exists in the US, and I am very, very skeptical about assuming US data applies to Canadian school systems, but I think that they often ask good questions and we can learn something from the questions they're asking. What we need is our own data to answer it. So a really important report was developed by the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine in 2017 called Monitoring Educational Equity. It's a consensus report by a huge number of scholars from across Canada and the US, or mostly the US and even Canada, that tries to set out a broad framework for educationally significant data if you want to understand equity. And again, I'm going to point out we have no conversation similar to this going on across Canada. And again, that's sort of how this ties back into Christine's presentation. Is essentially what Monitoring Educational Equity, the report that I just mentioned, suggests is that it would be really important to look not just at outcomes, and you saw that in Christine's work, but also educational opportunities. So it's very easy to focus on outcomes, but the problem with that is that you really do wind up with a bit of a tendency to not understand what are the contextual factors that led to those outcomes, which makes an agenda around change much harder. So the typical outcomes that they looked at are around achievement and engagement in school, and the opportunities they looked at tended to focus on contextual factors, access to high quality, broad curriculum, rigorous curriculum. So when we look at things like streaming, that would tend to fit in there. Access to supportive school and classroom environments, including access to appropriate supports for special education, for mental health, presence of caring adults at schools, and positive disciplinary climate. The TRC makes it really clear that in terms of First Nations education, we also have to look at parent involvement in school and well-being. So we added those to the monitoring educational equity framework. And it turns out it's a really big job to do this work. So we didn't get all the way. This is really the beginning of some of the work. So next question, who are we studying? Are we studying systems? Are we studying students? In terms of Ontario, we have parallel and intersecting systems of education serving First Nations students. The vast majority of First Nations students attend provincially funded schools. There are 2 million students in Ontario overall, 5,000 schools, 72 school boards, and within that population, there's just about 42,000 First Nations students. Not all of those students identify for statistics purposes as First Nations. A lot of people have their doubts about educational bureaucracies and prefer to sort of fly under the radar. We know that there are First Nations students in almost every school in Ontario. Sort of, as I say, running in parallel, we have First Nations schools. Those are mostly funded by the federal government and operated by individual First Nations. There is some complexity around that, but you don't need to know for now. There are about 20,000, just under 20,000 students in 2021-22 in First Nations schools, and there are 111 schools across Ontario. An additional almost 6,000 students live in First Nations schools and attend provincially funded schools through different educational agreements. So it actually means that money is coming out of the First Nations to pay for students to pay tuition to attend provincially funded schools. So that's the broad landscape of First Nations students in schools in Ontario. And we do have kind of 3 groups. This presentation really focuses on the students in provincially funded schools. So what are valid, comparable, and potentially available measures that we have right now? Again, you're back to Christine's discussion, and we're looking now at the provincial data systems, which is where the richest data exists, and where, provinces have the power to decide what data they are going to collect, and to make boards produce that data for them. And I note that I think that the education data infrastructure in Ontario is a disaster. So if we wanted, for example, to see how First Nations students were progressing into post-secondary, the government takes the First Nation self-identification data from the K-12 system and strips it off the OEN when the students move into post-secondary. So we can't answer really fundamental questions about progression in Ontario. The logical first step is to take the data that's already exists, and that's, what's typically termed administrative data, and Dr. Saint-Denis was talking about that already. To try and get that, the Chiefs of Ontario had to enter into a data sharing agreement, which took 2 years to negotiate, and at the end of which they were able to receive depersonalized data on some really important topics of concern to them. It was broken down by school board, and they separated self-identified First Nation students and then students supported through agreements, so students living in First Nations communities. To get data on First Nations schools, because they are typically one school at a time, it's not as simple a process. So we're really only looking at that provincial data in this report, but we are working on trying to get all these kinds of data. So we produce these reports. Report number 1 was on student outcomes in provincially funded schools. and it used that data we'd arrived at through data sets. The most critical information I believe that we collected in this report is not about what we typically think of as outcomes such as graduation or test scores, but actually about attendance. Attendance is one of the most important predictors of long-term outcomes for students. We did with my colleagues, Rob Brown and Jillian Perec, we took Toronto District School Board, we took 10 cohorts of students. We looked at everything in elementary school that made a difference for students, including, poverty, grades, EDI scores, you name it, minority language status, all those things. The things that made the biggest difference were attendance, suspensions, and congregated special ed. So if you want to know what's going to help people in the long term, going to school is probably one of the most important things. Unfortunately, what our data showed, not perhaps a total surprise, is that there is significant gaps in terms of chronic absenteeism, which is defined typically in the research literature as missing 10% or more of classes. What you see, there's a couple of different things this graph might show you. First of all, it's that attendance generally has really gone down since the pandemic. That's not a surprise to anyone, but that 10% decline for the general Ontario population is really significant. Unfortunately, it went down more sharply from an already low base for First Nations students generally, and for even worse for First Nations students in First Nations communities. So that, I would say, should be, if you are concerned with trying to equalize educational attainment in a generation, the sort of commitment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this would be a major priority for equity work, is to try and find effective evidence-based attendance promotion programs. That requires resources in areas like social work and school boards. And by and large, we have not seen any increase in funding for those areas, despite the fact we do have an attendance crisis in Ontario, and one that does not affect all students equally. It's really important to note that this is not a homogeneous picture, that all First Nations do not have the same situation, and that there's very significant differences across the province. In all cases, First Nations students are less likely or are more likely to have chronic absenteeism. However, the gaps are very different as you move across the province. And so you may need to have a different strategy depending on whether you're in Eastern versus Northwest Ontario. Grade 9 credit accumulation, again, it's a holistic measure of how students are doing. There tends to be an emphasis on test scores when we want to think about student progress, but grade 9 credit accumulation, wide research base, tells us this is the on-track measure for whether students are going to graduate. What I think is really interesting about this is that this is, as far as I'm aware, and I have tried quite hard to find it, this is the only province-wide data we have illustrating a point that many of us concerned about COVID tried to make, which is that students who are already vulnerable tend to have much worse impacts when they had the education-related disruptions that flowed with COVID. So what we see generally is that across Ontario, there was a very slight dip. That's the black line. There was a very slight dip in grade 9 credit accumulation during the COVID years. For First Nations students, the dip was far more severe. That's not really surprising when you think about the issues around broadband, around generally much more severe COVID outcomes in their communities. but it really does reflect the reality, the global reality, that more vulnerable students were more affected by COVID. And we haven't seen in Ontario much effort to ensure that recovery funds were targeted for particularly vulnerable communities. In fact, we've seen only universal approaches to COVID recovery, and those have been phased out. So that's a real worry. We've also seen steady growth in the number of students excelling. Students with averages over 80% in grade 9. That number has been growing over the last 5 years, and that's a really important trend to pay attention to as well. There's still a gap, but it is not an all bad news story, and that is a huge risk that a lot of First Nations are concerned when they share this data. Four-year graduation rates, there's been a very steady improvement, both provincially and for First Nation students. So while we have seen a 4% growth, and a 4% is significant when you're looking at a whole population of students, unfortunately, the growth has kind of kept track with province-wide improvements in graduation rates. And so there hasn't been a closing of the gap, which is, and I will remind you, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talks about the importance of trying to close the gap in a generation. You need additional resources. Chiefs of Ontario talk about Parity Plus if you want to accelerate this process. And again, there's also tremendous regional variation. So this is the provincial average. There's a 35% gap in four-year graduation. But in a bunch of the school boards around the GTA, the gap is less than 5%. So these gaps are not inevitable, and they can be changed, but they will not sort of self-correct. I want to also take a moment to talk about on-time graduation, which is something that Christine discussed earlier. There's a whole debate about 4 versus 5-year graduation as a measure of educational success. Ontario chooses to report on 5-year graduation. That's really handy from a public accountability point of view because gaps are smaller when we look at 5-year graduation, but post-secondary trajectories are very different for students who graduate in 4 years versus 5 years. So if what we're looking at long-term is trying to, first of all, make sure everybody graduates and finishes and has lots of opportunities, it is likely that the opportunities will be greater for students if they're graduating in 4 years. And you see here in this graph that almost twice as many First Nation students are in that 5-year group than the 4-year group. So the province doesn't report on I'm going back, 35% gap. They report on a 29% gap, but that is only for 5-year graduation. And it is the perspective from the Chiefs of Ontario that that's not the right measure. And what is even more worrying is that the number of First Nation students graduating with a certificate, not the OSSD, but a certificate, has tripled in the last 5 years. The final thing I want to talk about is our second report, which was focused on suspensions. And remember, if you think back to monitoring educational equity, one of the things they say is critical if you want to have an equitable system is that there is equitable access to a positive disciplinary climate. And I suspect you will not be shocked to hear that there is, in fact, rather than equitable access to a positive disciplinary climate, there is shocking disproportionality when we get to suspensions. So according to the National Academies, this is the critical measure of equity in disciplinary climates. American research, which has typically focused on disproportionality with respect to Black students, but they've also got studies on Latin American students and some other ethnic groups, Indigenous students there too. Racial disproportionality persists even when we control for socioeconomic status. When there are studies that show Black students are far more likely to be reported for the same infraction as white students are not reported for. And that's whether you look at educator records or student self-reports. And the US research and Canadian research shows us that students who are suspended are much less likely to graduate and go on to PSE, including if you look at students who are otherwise comparable. So using logistic regressions to say, you know, students who have a otherwise similar academic record, that incident of suspension is a real push-out factor. We have seen quite a bit of research showing racialized students are more likely to be suspended in Canada as well. And there is a number of boards that have been collecting really good data on this. And it's been appropriately considered to be a real critical crisis in a couple of the boards. Unfortunately, there's very little data on elementary suspensions outside of this report. I haven't seen very much, at least. And what our data shows is what I would consider to be a tragedy in the making. On average, students in elementary school, that is, students younger than grade 8, are 5 times more likely to be suspended. There is considerable variation between boards. There are some boards where 1 in 4 Indigenous students have been suspended. And there are other boards that have been working very, very hard to reduce suspension rates and which have achieved 2 times the disproportionality, which is still really a lot. If you think about the Peel reports that caused such a appropriate concern, that was about 2.6 times disproportionality. Suspension is a canary in a coal mine issue. It's not uncomplicated, and you can't wish away some range of social needs that leads elementary school students to be suspended. But it is a point which tells us that there's a need for action and re-engagement. And I think this evidence shows that a lot of Ontario school boards have a lot of work to do in terms of coming up with better solutions for students. In secondary school, the disproportionality is also appalling. It's about 2.6 times, but it is not as bad as elementary school. So in fact, it's younger students which are having the worst problems. And that just makes me feel quite sick to my stomach. I saw in the comments that someone else was talking about the school to prison pipeline and ongoing colonialism. Justice Canada has reported for the last several years, it's been 25 years at least, that there's this massive problem of overrepresentation. Despite the fact it's been recognized as a big problem, it has continued. And in a number that seems sort of scarily resonant, we know that Indigenous people are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than the general population. And in very big comprehensive reports, Justice Canada has reported on some of the factors they think are behind that. And they say it's really important that we look at how colonial values, policies, and practices have created this acute social problem. But they'd never talk about schools as a place to try and prevent this a real catastrophe of disengagement and long-term harm. And there is actually quite a lot of money in crime prevention budgets and public safety budgets, but it's not being used to address school-related disciplinary issues. And we do know that there are effective discipline programs. It wasn't our job to solve it, but it is not insoluble, and it should be a matter of urgent concern that we see these kinds of disproportionalities. So briefly, how do we make this data useful? There we are again. There's our Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They hoped that by reporting on these disparities in attainment and opportunities and funding, that we would be able to get the kind of funding that was required to close gaps, and the kinds of other supports as well. That burden should not be only about First Nations schools. It needs to also be about provincially funded schools. It was the intention of the Chiefs of Ontario that these reports have a big impact. And I have to say, I've almost never worked on anything that had less pickup by the media, despite a fairly intensive effort to get someone to report on it. It's a picture of Solma Makwa, who's the lone First Nations MPP in Ontario. He is the only MPP who asked a question about this data. And it was months after we released it. So we really haven't had very much public pickup. And I think you can ask some questions about why these results, which highlight disparities that we could do things about if we wanted to, don't get more attention. And these are all the members of the research team. On the larger Systemic Gaps project, Christine's been a big part of it. And I am happy to answer questions. And once again, here's the QR code if you want to read the reports.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gallagher-Mackay, for your presentation. And also, like, I wasn't aware of it too, and I was just, blown away by the data that you managed to collect on disproportionate discipline. And I think hopefully there'll be somehow an avenue to get more traction around this, because it's really great research. So at this time, I'm going to open it up to questions. Very much. We're out of time now, so that's all the time we have for today. But I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Corso and Dr. Gallagher-Mackay, for such a wonderful presentation. In the chat there's some thank yous coming in. I want to thank all the attendees and apologize again for the Zoom information being incorrect, but so glad that many of you could stay till the end. Want to thank you so much for to both of the presenters, and to Sherry Fox, of course, for managing everything as normal. So thank you again, Dr. Gallagher-Mackay and Dr. Christine Corso, for amazing presentations. I hope to hear this again. I want to follow up on your research as it's published too, and we'll make sure that that is made available to our membership, that they can read your reports. The links to the reports will include those too. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.